back, Scott.
Thank you. Great to be back, Leighton. I like the introduction. That's pretty fancy.
Yeah, that's thanks to Ken and another good friend, Andy, the Invisible Gardener. That's his original music. So, yeah, so I guess, as you can hear, I've got a bad case of, I guess, laryngitis, but we're going to try to push through it today. But let's start with how's the weather out there? Is it spring sprung yet?
Well, so yeah, spring basically arrived this last week. So yeah, we had spring in January, February, and March with record-setting temperatures most weeks. I mean, it was a very warm late winter. Trees were budding, flowers were blooming, and those of us that live in Colorado know that that is a false spring, and it's going to be the reality of winter soon after. But it never happened. Our winter was very mild and very warm, and then about 2 weeks ago we got down to 20 degrees overnight, killed a lot of the flowers, killed all of the blossoms on all the fruit trees that were early. And so I've been recovering for 2 weeks in my garden because my asparagus was devastated. I just had a lot of death throughout my garden because a late spring is normal, but a severe cold like that is unusual. And last 3 days ago, we had a frost, and the long range forecast actually looks like there's no more frost, at least 10 days out. And my average last frost date is in a week. So mathematically, it looks like spring is here, winter is gone. I'm kind of rolling the dice and putting some seeds in the garden and hoping that that is indeed what's going to happen.
So on all the flowering trees, are you going to lose the fruit for this year?
Oh yeah, it's already lost. My plum tree was covered with hundreds of blossoms. They all were frozen and dropped. My peach trees lost all of their blossoms. I'd have some apple trees. So when I chose apple trees, the idea between apples, when you plant apples, is you need at least 2 trees that are flowering at the same time, because apples can't pollinate themselves. They need another tree for pollination. And so when I put in, I think I've got about 10 apple trees, I put them in different pairs that would flower at different times. And so the early blossoms are all gone, but I still have some apple trees that are just now starting to bloom. So I'll have some fruit on the apples, but the pears, the peaches, the plums, all the rest, they're done. Absolutely nothing's going to happen this year.
Oh, that's such a shame.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that I was in the Air Force traveling all around, and I'd have gardens in different states. California, no surprise, so easy to grow, everything works. But Colorado, of all the places I've lived, is the most challenging region for gardeners. And we all just accept that we're probably not going to get a crop, but we're going to try anyway. And then when we do get a crop, it just tastes so much better and it's so much more satisfying because we had to work so hard to get it.
So that being said, there's nothing you can do. You can't cover them or put a smudge pot out or some type of temperature control, correct?
Well, and so it depends. So in my garden, I have tall metal hoops over my beds, and so I can put plastic over. I can put different covers. But Colorado State University did a pretty in-depth study about 25 years ago now, I think it was, where they tested the different types of covers and how much difference it actually made. And so a plastic sheet over a garden bed or over plants only gains you about 3, maybe 4 degrees of extra protection. And so if the temperature is going to drop down to freezing, yeah, you can throw plastic over it and that negates any potential frost damage. But when the temperature drops below 28 degrees, that's a hard freeze and cellular damage starts happening. And then when it drops down to like 20 degrees where I was, it doesn't matter how much protection, how many plastic sheets or covers or tarps or anything, that's not going to temperature improvement. And so I saw that coming, and it's like, it's wasted effort. If I throw plastic over, the plants will think it's 23 degrees instead of 20 degrees, but that's not enough to prevent damage. For larger areas, and it depends what's causing the temperature change. So like in western Colorado, we have regions with a lot of peach trees in particular. And if the temperature has an inversion layer so that their air is warmer above the temperature on the ground, the orchards there have fans, and they do the same thing in Florida, and they do the same thing in California in particular. And so these huge fans will actually disrupt the air to bring in some of that warmer air that's higher up, or they'll do the smudge pots. And when you do that in combination, you can actually make a difference on a large scale. But this cold actually was reading some reports. Most of the Colorado peach crop is gone this year. The entire industry was devastated because some of the farms that had the fans were able to save some of their trees, but it was more from the exhaust of the engines that were driving the fans. That heat was enough to keep the farms going. And the farms that didn't have a heating system or the fans lost everything.
That's crazy. Yeah, I witnessed exactly that phenomenon out here 4 years ago in an avocado orchard, and I couldn't believe it. It was like it looked like a bomb went off and killed these 10 trees, and everything around them on all sides was fine.
Yeah,
And
it's crazy.
yeah, and he said, yeah, it's these like reverse cyclones or reverse tornadoes where the cold just comes screaming down and nukes a series of trees and then disappears.
Yeah.
So it's very unusual kind of weather pattern.
And it can actually be horizontal too. And I was gardening at the school garden, about 25,000 square feet of garden, had a night like that, and the top 8 to 10 inches of all of the plants were frozen. But below that, there was no damage whatsoever. And it was basically a horizontal wind shear of severe cold that blew across. And it's crazy what the air will do to plants depending on what's the temperature and the strength of it and the humidity and all those other factors.
Yep, absolutely. So what elevation are you at?
So I'm at 7,000 feet. My garden is almost exactly 7,000 feet.
Now, were the folks lower in altitude survive, or do they get killed too?
So it depends. Generally there's a 3-degree difference per 1,000 feet, and so in my region, Colorado Springs is 500 to 800 feet lower than me. So I'm generally 2 to 3 degrees colder than it is in town, and so there are days that I will lose, or at least my plants will have damage, whereas in town, just 10 miles away, they won't have that same damage because of the elevation difference. But the farms on the other side of the Rockies, in the Grand Junction area, Palisades, Colorado, they are even lower still, but they sit up against the western edge of the Rockies, and so when that Canadian cold front comes through, it just barrels down the mountains, and altitude doesn't have as much play because you just have cold air, and cold air sinks, and it really doesn't matter what your elevation is when we have those kind of severe cold storms.
Got you. So it's really, there's nothing you can do. It is what it is.
It is what it is, yeah. And you've got the good years, you got the bad years. Apparently, all these farms had insurance, so they're not going to lose the farm, but they've lost their crops.
It must be frustrating as heck to a farmer.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what else is going on? What are you starting to grow this year?
Yeah. So just this week, I started putting in some of my cool season crops. So I've got peas and spinach and radishes and carrots and a lot of beets and some turnips and those mainly root crops and, some brassicas and the ones that can handle the cool season. Because like I said, technically my frost could still hit for the next 3 weeks. And so it's still too early, even though it looks good. I'm not going to put my tomatoes and my peppers and the squash in for at least 3 weeks, probably 4
I'm
weeks.
assuming they're in the greenhouse right now.
Yes, I actually do have some in the greenhouse. I've been starting them indoors. Now my greenhouse is unheated. And so all of those type of plants really need to have a nighttime temperature of 50 degrees or above. And so it's just been this week that my greenhouse is staying at 50 degrees overnight, because the temperatures have been in the 30s or the low 40s. And my unheated greenhouse overnight will maintain a 10 to 15 degree heat over the outside air temperature. And so I did move some of those plants into the greenhouse just today to get used to the sun, harden them off for the outdoors before I put them in the ground. But most of what I have is still indoors in my basement with my nice household heat.
What kind of skin do you have on your greenhouse? Is it insulated or?
So it's a polycarbonate. So it's a double-walled polycarbonate. And so there's basically 2 layers of polycarbonate, which is incredibly durable. And then there is an airspace between, I think it's 4 millimeters of airspace in between. And that provides some insulation. But particularly in an unheated greenhouse, it can act against you just like it can act for you. So it does a great job of warming the greenhouse when the sun is shining. But at night, when the temperature starts to cool, it can become a refrigerator. If the inside air temperature actually becomes colder than outside, that insulation will actually hold the cold inside the greenhouse.
Double-edged sword.
Yeah. So I've got 350 gallons of water to act as kind of a thermal battery that absorbs the heat during the day. All the sun's rays shining inside the greenhouse will warm that water. And so at night, that water, the barrels of water, will help moderate the air temperature within the greenhouse so it doesn't get as cold, but it can still get cold.
You ever heard of trom walls?
Are those the water like tubes?
No, actually, it's more like creating thermal mass. So what you're doing with your water, except for it's like a wall.
Oh, okay.
So because it heats up during the day and then releases the heat at night. This is something that's very often used in like desert environments where they get super hot during the day and super cold at night. So it's a way of kind of regulating the temperature drops or variations during the, warming it during the day so it's sucking the heat in, keeping the rooms cooler, and then at night it releases the heat back into the living space. I don't know if that's possible in your area, but it might be.
Well, so it is. When you talk about the different materials, so like rock, stone, concrete, are pretty efficient at doing that, and that's why in the summer you can't walk across the sidewalk because it's so hot. And so you use that same basic concept, and you can do that in a greenhouse. On the north wall, you would have a concrete. I've seen greenhouses like that where there's like a concrete wall about halfway up, and that thermal mass works. I'd have concrete pavers in my greenhouse along with gravel to achieve that same effect. But because of the curve on my greenhouse, on that back wall, I have foam insulation with like aluminum foil front to help reflect some of the heat into the greenhouse. But that concept of that's why I asked about water, because there is a system that will have the entire back wall basically just layers of tubes filled with water, and it achieves the same thing. It's a thermal mass that absorbs the heat and then slowly releases it at night.
Yep, same idea. I'm sure you've heard of a wallopini. That was the
Oh yeah, yeah. I've got a good friend that gardens in a Wallapini.
Yeah, they're very cool.
Hmm.
All right, so I know we've talked about this before, but let's touch a little bit on your fertility regimen. Like, what is your go-tos for certain times of the year to keep the plants healthy?
So, it's interesting because I was getting some comments today, and I watched a few videos earlier about fertilizing the garden, and the regimen you should follow this many times over the course of the season, and use these types of fertilizers. But I don't fertilize my garden at all. I do a pretty heavy soil amending with organic matter in the fall, and then we'll touch up the beds a little bit in spring with compost primarily. And I just let the organic matter and the soil biology feed my plants. I think it's, from a gardening perspective, it's really easy to get your soil out of balance by adding macronutrients or micronutrients, and plants are able to uptake all of the different nutrients, but some of the nutrients essentially will block the uptake of other nutrients. And so, for instance, you have too much phosphorus in the soil, and phosphorus is the P of NPK, a primary macronutrient. If you get too much in your soil, you're going to block the uptake of things like calcium and other important macronutrients. And common problem with gardeners who grow tomatoes is blossom end rot. And blossom end rot is a calcium deficiency while the fruit is forming on that tomato. And so a lot of people think, oh, I'll just fertilize with calcium, and that will solve the problem. But if you do a soil analysis, you may find out that you have too much phosphorus or too much potassium that is blocking the uptake of the calcium. So there's enough calcium in pretty much all the soil on our planet to grow tomatoes. It's just a question of what kind of balance you have. And I prefer to have nature determine that balance, because I've got the organic matter already in the soil, and it's that organic matter that will provide the nutrients for the plants.
So that's a great point, and this was something that I wanted to try to freaking remember. I can't remember if it's a Mulder or Muller chart. It basically shows you the nutrients and which ones affect the other ones and affect the plant in very strange ways. I don't know, Ken, if you could just search real quick Mulder or Muller chart, and it's about chemistry, because that's one of the important things that is not a lot talked about, is that these imbalances that can happen when you are a moron and you put too much of one thing on, and it creates an imbalance somewhere else.
Yeah, and one of the most common errors that gardeners make is, nitrogen is arguably the most important nutrient that plants need. And so when you look at these regimens of weekly fertilization during the course of a gardening season, it's almost always a high nitrogen fertilizer that is recommended, quote unquote. But the thing about the nitrogen is it is for green growth. It's for the leaves. It's for the plant to just really skyrocket towards the sun. And too much nitrogen means that the flowers aren't going to be developing, and then the fruit isn't going to be developing from those flowers. And so when someone tells me, I've got these big, beautiful tomato plants, but I'm not getting any fruit, well, I say, get a soil test done, and it's probably going to show that you have too much nitrogen. And it's not that the nitrogen is locking out other nutrients, it's that the nitrogen is the most abundant of the nutrients, and that's how the plant is reacting, by putting out new, young, strong green growth at the expense of the flowers and the fruit.
Wise words, my friend, wise words. And the other thing it does too is it creates unhealthy growth, which brings in insects and pesticides.
Exactly. Yeah, the bugs are going to be going for all that nice, sweet, tender stuff that and particularly, because this, I don't recommend fertilizing much at all unless you know you have a specific nutrient deficiency that plant needs. It's not a good idea to fertilize during the summer because of your point. You get that young growth at the peak of summer. Now the sun's rays are going to fry the tips, the edges. The insects are going, oh, there's a weak plant. Look at all that juice. And now you have an insect population that just devastates your plants because you had too much nitrogen at the wrong time of year.
Yeah, and you can actually make them sick. I've seen that too, where the plant essentially dies because it's just got so much nitrogen in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And and even I talk about not adding nitrogen, but even too much of the organic matter in the soil can create the same imbalance. My garden is relatively new. I've been here 7 years now, but those first 4 years in particular, I was doing regular amending, a lot of organic matter, and I did a soil test at the beginning to show the deficiencies of my soil. And then I did a soil test 3 years later after having done this regular heavy amending in fall, and I had too much of some of those macronutrients. And so I took a whole year off from amending to try to get my soil back in balance, because just the organic matter and the biology in the soil releasing those nutrients made it so that there was too much of the nutrients that could be harmful for the plant.
So then you did start by building what we call a nutrient pool in the soil.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah. So you accomplished what we call the foundation. You get the soil to the optimum chemistry balance, and then now you turn it loose, because whatever's growing there is going to pull nutrients out. But as you recompost it or chop and drop, or at the end of the season, compost everything back down, you're replenishing the soil nutrient pool.
Exactly. Yeah. And it reaches a point, depending on the plant you're growing, there are some heavy feeders. There are plants that do require one type of nutrient over another. The rooting vegetables, for instance, are going to need more phosphorus and potassium, and the leafy vegetables are going to need more nitrogen and phosphorus. And so when you look at the differing requirements, you can realize that kind of crop rotation falls into this.
Thanks, man.
There you go. There's the Mulder's chart. But the idea is that you don't have to amend every single year when you get to that level that you're talking about. And you just kind of rotate your plants so that you can go every 2 or 3 years between the heavy soil amending.
And that's the whole point of rotating crops in different soils, is to not strip them.
Exactly. Yeah.
And everybody should have that Mulder chart. Anybody that's growing anything.
Yeah, that's good. So
it's very, very helpful.
I've seen that before, but I actually need to add it to my toolbox.
Yeah. It's just a wonderful way to see, like, oh, if this is out of balance, these are the things I'm looking for in my plant reaction.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And then my other question was, do you target compost? In other words, I'm going to take my tomato plants, the plants after I've done harvesting, I'm going to compost those separately from some of the other things, so that when I re-amend my tomato plot, I'm putting the compost that came from that plant back on the soil.
That's actually a really good idea. And I do recommend that, depending on how you compost, and if you've got multiple compost piles or bins that you're using, because each plant is pulling up, like I mentioned earlier, different nutrients for whatever that plant type is. Comfrey is a very popular plant, particularly for gardeners who want to make their own fertilizer. And I do that. I grow comfrey for the purpose of taking the leaves and making not so much a tea, but water where the nutrients have leached into it. And the reason for it, and the one reason why a lot of people are looking at it, is because comfrey is a plant that will actually draw, I think it's like 14 different elemental nutrients into the leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can take those leaves and then make it into compost or make it into an extract or a leachate or a tea, whatever you want to call it, however you're doing it. And then you apply that back into the soil to replenish those specific nutrients. I take more of a, in my book, I talk about it as well, where if you do the same ingredient in a compost pile, so like your example of the tomato plants, you're basically making a cheese pizza. It's got crust, it's got sauce, and it's got cheese. It's very basic and it works. It's got nutrients, but it's only got that narrow tower of nutrients. I like to make the combination pizza. I want the pizza that's got the crust and the sauce and the olives and the peppers and the sausage and the pepperoni. So my compost is pepper plants and tomato plants and lettuce plants and weeds of all different types and comfrey leaves, so that the compost I'm producing has hopefully a spectrum of nutrients. And now I can use that compost on my tomatoes or my peppers or my melons or whatever it happens to be.
That makes a lot of sense. We call it diversity, diversity, diversity.
Yeah.
No matter who gets it, it works.
Yeah.
Now let's zone in on comfrey a little bit, because this is one of the plants that you got to kind of be careful of too, because it is a dynamic accumulator. It can pull up bad things like heavy metals. It's used often in bioremediation. So what do you teach your followers about comfrey?
So first, if I see Squishy Mirror asking about Bocking 14. So Bocking 14 is a particular variety of comfrey, because the other thing, what I thought you were going to say, is that comfrey can actually spread very easily. But the Bocking 14 won't. So that's, if you have a choice, try to get the Bocking 14, either root cuttings or the seeds for that. And that cuts out the chance that it's going to flower and reseed and take over a yard. So that's actually the first thing. And I'm glad that they brought that up, because that's the first thing I tell people about comfrey, is just be aware that it can spread, and it spreads very efficiently through its roots. So if you put it in and then decide you don't want it, it's worse than dandelions. If you leave any stub of a root in the soil, you're going to grow a whole new plant. So that is also a very efficient method of propagating, is the root cuttings to grow more plants. I've got 6 comfrey plants in my landscape right now, and I'm not worried about the heavy metals or any of those other issues, because I've had soil testing done before I put any of my plants in. And that's an important consideration, as you know, is establish a baseline, know what your soil is, and then that will help determine potential future problems or potential fixes or potential uses where you have a nutrient accumulator, a dynamic accumulator like comfrey, and you can use that to your benefit.
Another trick for if you can't get the Bach 14 is to use like a concrete pipe that's used for sewer drains, and you sink that down 6 feet in the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't spread. And you get. Good.
I was going to say I attempted something like that with my horseradish, and horseradish roots don't go quite as deep as the comfrey roots. But I thought sinking 2 feet in would be enough, and it wasn't. My horseradish escaped. So yeah, you're exactly right. It needs to be multiple feet in the ground to keep it from spreading. Yeah. Yeah.
So I did this European kitchen herb project back in Connecticut, and I went back to the landscape architect and I go, dude, some of these plants that you're speccing are so aggressive. They're going to just take this whole thing over. Have you thought about any kind of root guard, or maybe put them in pots instead of burying them in the ground in the garden? And he was like, no, what are you talking about? So I gave him his plant palette back, with the suspect plants that I was like, you're asking for a nightmare in 3 years. Like, forget it. The rest of the garden's just going to get pushed out. So we came up with a couple of different concepts similar to that. It did work. I haven't been back there in 4 years, 5 years, but it did work for the years that I was present. But like you said, you got to still be careful, because if they go to seed and you're not paying attention, the seeds can get out of that container and you've just, wiped yourself out.
Yeah, that actually happened with my horseradish this last year. So I grow my horseradish and my mint in animal troughs. So 3-foot high metal troughs with a few holes in the bottom for drainage. And that's worked very well to retain all of the plant growth and avoid the spread. But there was a brief period this summer that my horseradish actually seeded, and I had some popping up around the edges.
Were you able to capture it?
Yes. It was one of those, I'm kind of a live and let live, talking about diversity. I will let plants live in the periphery of my beds, because they're food and their homes and their shelter for a lot of insects, a lot of beneficial insects in particular. And so I saw these plants pop up, and it's like, I don't know that I recognize those. And of course, it had the same leaf as the plant that was 2 feet in the air above it. But you don't always recognize that in the moment. And once I came back, like the next day, it's like, oh, wait, those are horseradish leaves, and I need to pull those before they get established. And, easy to deal with when they're at the seedling stage.
So another thing I'd love to cover is like when you compost your weeds, because I'm a big fan of composting weeds. Like, I love them. They're indicator plants. They're going to be full of certain nutrients. How do you protect yourself from getting the seeds germinating in your compost pile? I have the answer, but I want you to talk about it.
Yeah. So the key, and I've answered this question 2 or 3 times this last week on my channel on YouTube, because that's a big concern. I was on a podcast recently talking about doing weeds in compost, and that was the immediate response. How do you avoid weeds? Well, you kind of answered your own question. It's all about the seeds. So if you can dig up the weeds before they set seed, or you chop the weeds before they set seed, then you're not going to have any weed seeds that are going to be in your compost. If you miss that point, if for some reason you're cleaning up the garden, you're just pulling the weeds, cutting the weeds, throw them in the compost, and you don't care about whether they've got weed seeds or not, to reduce that possibility, and in some cases, if you do it right, eliminate the problem, you have to have a hot compost pile. You have to have the pile at 160 degrees sustained for about 3 days, and that will kill the weed seeds that are potentially in that compost pile. I'm a lazy composter. I'm not getting my pile that hot, so I just avoid putting the weeds in that have set seed.
Great point. And the one thing I'd like just to follow through on that is that, getting to 160 is easy. Maintaining 160 is a bitch, because sometimes it just keeps going. And if you get above 180, you're starting to generate alcohols. And at 190, you could spontaneously combust. People don't understand the dangers of that. When you're getting at 160, you got to watch it hard. And so that's
And then the corrective action to get in to break that climb, if you don't do it right, now the temperature drops below 160 very quickly. And so it's challenging to be in that 160 to 165 range for a sustained time, because you're right, the thermophilic bacteria just goes nuts and doesn't know when to stop. As long as it's got food and oxygen and moisture, it's going to keep generating heat.
Yeah, they're suicidal.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, great. I love the answer and the understanding. And just so the audience knows, I've had weed seeds germinate and I've hit 170 for a sustainable period of time. Not all of them are guaranteed to die. And even tomato seeds, those guys are some of the toughest
True.
seeds on the planet.
Yeah. This year I started 22 different varieties of tomatoes that I've got in my basement, and I intentionally went to my boxes of seeds that always accumulate. And so I was putting 7 and 8. I had one that was 11 years old. And so I've had old tomato seeds that weren't in perfect storage, and they've all germinated. So it's really hard to kill tomato seed, either from neglect or heat or anything else you're trying to do.
So here's another one. Do you like plant multiple seeds in a pot and then select the one that you think is the best?
Yes. But so there's always a caveat, right? So this year with those old seeds, I didn't do a germination test ahead of time. I did exactly that. I put 2 to 3 seeds, and I was using a 72 cell tray. So in all 72 cells, I was putting tomato seeds, and I was doing 2 to 3 seeds per cell, anticipating that these old seeds would not give me perfect germination. Well, I pretty much had 99% germinations. I had 200 tomato seedlings in this tray, basically. And it's hard as a gardener who likes to grow plants to sacrifice. So what I did, so I took the individual cells, and when I transplanted up into pots, some of them I would take one out and put it in its own individual pot because it was particularly strong looking. Others, I would just go ahead and do 2 or 3 in a pot, so that at the next stage, I'll do the same thing. I'll save the strongest ones and then put the others in the compost. I've got a plant sale coming up with my local garden club, and so I'll be potting some up so we can sell at the plant sale. But I was just telling someone this the other day that I've killed more plants than many gardeners will ever grow. And it's because of that. At the school garden, we did a plant sale every year as a primary fundraiser. And I would grow between 3,000 and 5,000 plants. And whatever didn't sell or we couldn't give away ended up in the compost pile. And a lot of the same methods, like I was just explaining. I got 200 tomato seedlings. I'm not growing 200 plants, but a lot of those are going to end up in the compost pile. So I gauge it on what kind of seed it is and how many seeds I have. I have other plants I'm trying the GMO purple tomato that you probably may know about, that was developed a couple years ago. And so I've got 6 of those seeds, and I put each of those in an individual pot so that I could do some analysis on the germination rates and how quickly they grew, so that they wouldn't be challenged by another plant nearby. But other than something like that, where it's unique and I'm doing some testing, I usually group them up and then have to kill the ones that don't make it.
Oh, you plant masochist, you.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm sure you got some friends. Can you just donate the ones that aren't quite big enough? Or
but yeah, I've got friends, I got family, but some of us have a big garden with a lot of beds, and most of the people I know, even the gardeners I know, might only have 1 or 2 beds that they're growing tomatoes in. So, they might only need 2 or 3 plants. And even then, most of them are either buying or growing the varieties that they prefer. And so it's surprising, because I appreciate your question, but it's surprising how hard it can be to give away tomato plants.
Interesting. Who knew, right? Who knew? All right, let's move back to composting. What is your ideal recipe of greens to browns?
And so, again, I'm a lazy composter, and I see Farmer Cheryl is asking about the lazy composting.
Let's talk.
So we were just talking about the hot pile, And so a hot pile, you really do want to get that balance of nitrogen and carbon, the greens and the browns, so that you develop the hot pile. You go through, from mesophilic bacteria to the thermophilic bacteria, and you generate that heat, and it's creating compost in a very fast pace. So you can put, if you have the proper, I know you know this, if you have the proper mix of nitrogen ingredients and carbon ingredients, and you've got the proper moisture level, and if the pile is aerated appropriately, you can have compost in a matter of just a couple weeks, because it happens very, very quickly. But you got to turn the pile, you got to water the pile, you got to do a lot of things to make that balance happen. And I'm too lazy to do that. So I will just, back to the idea of the combination pizza. I just throw whatever I have. And there are times when the pile is not breaking down very well, because I can see that it has too much carbon, too many brown ingredients. So I'll do a quick boost. In fact, I just did that yesterday, where I need nitrogen. So I go out in my garden and I pull a bunch of weeds, the green grassy weeds, and I throw that into my compost pile just to give it a nitrogen boost, and to try to build it up to, a more balanced level, so that the decomposition can break down the material. But I'm not that focused on the ratios, because my compost takes 3 or 4 months to decompose and to give me ingredients, because it's only breaking down when I pay attention to it, and I don't always pay attention to it. I'll just throw things in the pile and then let nature decide whether that's enough. And if I see that it's out of balance, yeah, maybe I'll add something to it. So that's basically the approach I take. When I create the pile, if I have enough organic material, I'll do the layers of 50-50 of the greens and the browns, because at least in my climate, a lot of the greens become browns pretty quickly, because the humidity is so low.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you don't water your piles.
Well, I do actually, because in the summer here in Colorado, we'll have days with single-digit humidity, and so if the pile looks like it's starting to dry out, or if it's ceased completely, I'll go in and I'll check it, and I do have to water my compost bins on a fairly regular basis.
So do you ever get putrefaction on the bottom of the pile?
No, I really don't. Well, I take it back. So there have been a few times we'll have the thunderstorms that roll off the Rocky Mountains and will dump torrential rain. I think last year we had like 2 inches in 30 minutes from a thunderstorm. And so there's been a few cases where the pile was pretty balanced. I had done, some watering to keep it moist. And then we had something like that dumped massive amounts of rain. And it's really only been in those instances. And it's easy for gardeners who have compost to recognize the difference, because that's when the anaerobic bacteria start coming into play, and the anaerobic bacteria makes the pile stink. And so if your pile is not stinky, you're doing things right. And if suddenly it's stinky, it's probably because of something like the putrefaction. There's too much rain that fell in too short a time.
Yeah, so I see that a lot, that people overwater their compost, and that's exactly what happens. So that's why I brought that up.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you compost in a basket, you can always roll it around and get some of the stuff off the bottom and add it back to the top when it dries out. And that's one way to avoid that.
Yeah.
That problem.
I'm not a big fan of the barrel composters, because it's so difficult to get that moisture level right. It's, basically a closed system once you put everything into the big barrel, and you can turn it, but you've got to open and check it to see if it's dry or it's wet. And that's, I've also seen that issue with people overwatering, and it kills everything, because it goes from aerobic to anaerobic pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I didn't mean the barrels that you see on the stands. I meant like the upright tubes. So
Oh, okay.
wire mesh cages. I mean, when I was first got out here, I was trapped in COVID. That's the first thing I did was I was like, all right, I need compost. And so I whipped up some wire baskets. I used chicken wire and then some screen on the inside so that the particles didn't fall out. And I would water it periodically because we in Southern California get no rain. Um, but I did overwater a couple of times and I'd had that problem. So I roll the basket
Got
and
it.
the stuff just falls out of the bottom, and then I wait till it dries out and pile
Yeah.
it in. But that's an easy way to compost if you don't have a lot of space. I did not have a lot of space, and this I could compost, almost a full yard in these barrels. I'd made 3 of them,
Oh, wow.
2-foot diameter, and then I could make enough compost because I live in the dunes, and literally it's sand dunes, so there's no organic matter in the soil. And I wanted to grow a little garden, so that's why I was, composting all of the landscape material, and I'd steal stuff out of my neighbors' waste barrels. Dude, it blew my mind when I got out here that people were taking all their organic matter off their property and shipping it, getting rid of it.
Yeah, putting it in a landfill somewhere.
It's insane. They're just stripping the nutrients right out of the very little soil that they actually have. But anyway, I'm glad you brought up the barrel thing because, I'm not a big fan of those plastic barrels. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's so much easier to turn with a pitchfork, on that small of a scale that they're really, they're almost like a greenwashing. They get people to try to commit, and then more often than not, they end up in the landfill because they don't work very well.
Yeah. Yeah, almost. I mean, I've tried a few different types of the plastic composters over the years, and I don't have any of them today because of that. I gave them away or, tossed them because they just don't work. They take up space that you don't have to use, and so different methods. And I like getting hands-on. So, when I water my garden, I prefer to do it by hand so that I can check on the plants, see if there's any pests or disease, moderate, the amount of water I use based on the weather and the soil moisture levels. And I do the same thing with compost. I agree with you. I like getting out there and hand turning, not with my hand, but like with a garden fork, and turn the material so you can see what the moisture level is. You can aerate it, and you can also see how quickly it's breaking down. So it is a little more effort. Even as a lazy composter, you do occasionally turn your pile, but it's a good way to gauge the health of the pile.
Yeah, plus you can get that smell. That's perfume to me. I just want to stuff my face in it every time. So back to temp. So you really don't monitor temperature much.
No, I have a 2-foot thermometer probe, and I do it occasionally. I measure my soil temperature almost every day this time of year to see what's happening with the soil. And so it's one of those things where I have it in my hand, I might as well measure the compost pile. But I'm not taking such a dedicated approach to my compost that I'm working on it. There, years ago, almost 30 years ago now, I was working with a guy who was fanatical about his compost. And he would get up early and do all the measurements of his pile before work, do any turning or watering or whatever he needed to do to get the temperature where he wanted it to be. And he would go home at lunch and measure the pile and do whatever corrections he needed to do. And he would do that every day. And he loved it. That his life was compost, and he would just create amazing compost in a matter of just a few weeks. But I've got more important things to do in my life than check the temperature of my compost 4 or 5 times a day.
I'm not quite that bad, but I do make a lot of compost, so I have to be very careful about maintaining it, because again, I'm shooting to get very, very high levels of soil food web organisms to a point that it's an inoculant for people. So that's critical that you maintain that Well, I hover at 120. I don't mind it getting down to 100. You know, target really is 110 because then I can be lazy. Like I don't have to go every
Yeah.
day and worry about it
Yeah.
because
And
I've mixed in the right ingredients to begin with.
and I aim for about 100 to 110.
Hmm.
And so, and in the summer, it's easy to get that. And so that's why, I'll go 3 or 4 days between measuring the temperature, and I don't see much variation because I'm not trying to sustain the heat.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm doing too is a lot of times I'm adding other things to the compost, i.e., some clay, which I've
Oh, okay.
find out is just it's amazing what happens when you add. And again, I'm not talking a ton of clay. I'm just talking about blending a little bit in, especially when I'm getting to temperature, when I'm getting to 120. It not only seems to calm things down, but at the end when I harvest it, the colors I get are nuts. I
Oh,
get
yeah.
purple, I'll get blue, I'll get red, dark red, light red, orange, yellow, little pockets of it. So it's like
That's cool.
the minerals all come together. You know, the birds of a feather flock together. Well, it's
Yes.
very similar in mineralogy. When you're dealing with biogeo chemical interactions and reactions, it just seems like they like to come together. And then, when I'll sell some of this compost to people, they're like, what is this blue stuff? Or what is this purple stuff? And I'm like, roll it in your fingers. And they're like, oh my God, is that clay? And I'm like, yeah. And the color is an indicator of what minerals are present. So not
I
only
have to
giving
try
you
that.
compost, I'm giving you some minerals that the bacteria can feed off of to feed your plant when they want it.
That's a
So
great idea.
yeah, that's been a really interesting journey. And I stumbled upon this probably 4 years ago. I'm here at Peach Hill Soils in Moore Park, California. I'm on a hard pan bed, so it's not concrete, it's not asphalt. It's basically compacted clay and sand with a little bit of silt in it. And so there's naturally stuff all over the place that I can mine. They take different soils in. So if I see a whole bunch of clay comes in and it's powdery and dusty, I'll grab a scoop of it, pile it up top, and then
Good.
blend a little bit of it in. And I've had some tremendous results as a result of playing with it. Another thing I like to do too is I've been playing recently with urchin shells. So there's a company out here that is not only they have two things. They harvest the red urchins for what's called uni. It's the organism inside of it, and it's a delicacy in the sushi world.
Okay.
So they have all this excess halves where they half the shell to get the uni. So I got those, and then they also have an invasive urchin, a purple urchin that eats the kelp forest that they're trying to.
Yeah, I've read about that one.
Yeah, so they have a grant, and these uni divers go out and they spend the whole day just harvesting the purple ones. Well, purple ones have no value, so they were getting landfilled. I'm like, no, 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 don't land.
Oh,
Bring them to me,
yeah.
and so I recently built a bed, laid down a plastic tarp, put down about 2 to 3 inches of we call nitralized shaving. So it's horse manure, uh, bedding, and hay that have been composted for 6 months, a year, super hydrophobic. And then I put the urchin shells down on top of that, put another 3 to 4 inches on top of that. Then I put a fabric over that, and then I put fresh ground organic matter, so gum. And the reason I use the gum is because it's a natural deodorizer. It pulls in all the volatile gases. So, because that's the one thing they warn me about. They're like, Leighton, if you start playing with this, it reeks. I mean, it smells like dead bodies. I'm like, that's no problem. I'll come up with a formula to deal with that so that it doesn't smell. And I've got one plot going now, and sure as shit, you pull that stuff off the top, you have no odor. As soon as you flip back the tarp and get into where the urchins are, dead bodies everywhere.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah.
But I started taking some of the stuff that they had produced as a soil amendment. And so this was basically crushed and ground. They had red urchin, purple urchin, and then spines. And they sent it off for testing, and it came back, and there was some heavy metal issues with it. There were some other problems, like it's just too much calcium.
Okay.
And I warned them, be careful if you put this on a tree, or shrub, or on an orchard, you can create some serious imbalances. So my recommendation is to compost it and not make a soil-based amendment, because people are stupid. They're going to think, oh, a little bit's good, more's better. And then you get customer complaints. So I've been working with them pretty closely. I started with them on a hydrolysis years ago, and then they've moved into this urchin stuff. And so we're in the beginnings of the process. But one of the things I did was I took 4 or 5 gallon buckets of this processed, washed, crushed shells mixed together, the red, the spines, and the purples, and I started blending it into my compost. Now, if you've ever added calcium to your compost pile, you talk about going thermophilic, man. It could go hyperthermophilic in a heartbeat. So you have to go really low and slow. So that was one of the struggles that I've been having with adding the calcium, is that I have to check it daily, because if I add a little bit too much, stuff starts to spike. Like I had it hit 140 in 2 hours of adding it.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like, damn, all right, I got to back off and not add so much. And what I ended up doing was grabbing some more of the compost that had not gotten the treatment and blended it together to get it to calm down. But my ideal goal is about 1%. If I can get 1% calcium by volume to this, it'll be in an organic form. It'll be bound up in the organic matter, tied up to the seed sites, or in the bacteria itself. I'll have softened the ability to use this as more of a soil, and proved out to them that, hey, bring it down here in volume. We can make you, a amendment that you can either bag or put in buckets or whatever, and sell that instead, because it's got a beautiful story to it. I mean, here again, recycling, repurposing stuff that was going to go to the landfill. People get behind that stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's not benefiting the landfill as it smells and decomposes, but it can definitely make a difference in the garden.
So that's some of the other fun things I get to do in my compost world, is, getting to play with different things and different amendments. And dude, if you've ever seen Peach Hill soils, I mean, Google Earth it. It's a playground, man. Every day I drive in, I go drive around the green pile to see what's been brought in. Sometimes I'll drive my skid steer down there and grab a bucket of this or a bucket of that. Other times I'll get them to give me 10 yards, 20 yards of something that's in there. So it's a playground for someone who's a compost enthusiast.
That's cool.
Yeah. So, all right, I'm gonna try to push through another 20 minutes here, because you can.
Okay.
I'm getting pretty hoarse. Let's talk a little bit about phosphorus. One of the unique things that I discovered a few years back, I was working on a project for a protea farm. So proteas are these interesting plants. They're about 300 million years old. They look like something out of Jurassic Park. There's so many variations. You've probably seen them and just didn't know that they were proteas. They're super phosphorus sensitive. And one of my ingredients in my product has a lot of phosphate solubilizing bacteria. So I wanted to do a little experiment. So I called my friend at Logan Labs. She's the lab manager down there. And I started asking her about phosphorus pools. I go, the soil that I am in out here in California does have a significant amount of phosphorus, and I'm concerned that by adding the fish brew or the fish mold, that with all those phosphate solubilizing bacteria, I'm going to volatilize all the phosphorus and kill these plants. And she stated, which I found very interesting. She goes, Leighton, when we test phosphorus, we're testing it at 1% of true value. So if you see a phosphorus level of 2,000 parts per million, that's literally only 1% of the pool. And I'm like, well, why would you do that? She goes, because phosphorus is so abundant in the soil. People don't know it. The only way that it can be volatilized or made available in that profile, because in organic phosphorus form is the hardest bond to break, is you need aquatic microorganisms. That's why they have problems with these phosphorus runoffs, killing streams, growing the algae, creating the toxic zones in the Gulf of Mexico. I knew that was the case. I just didn't realize that phosphorus was that abundant in the soils. And she's like, Leighton, we've fertilized the F out of everything to a point where the vast majority of it is getting washed down into the lower soil profiles where the plant can't get it. So when you talk about the problem with keeping plants focused on flowering, like the cannabis growers are all about nitrogen, phosphorus. That was it.
Yeah.
What are your feelings about the understanding that the pool is so much greater?
Well, so it's relative because it does depend on your soil. My soil is naturally low in phosphorus in my part of Colorado, and I'm sure you know this, but basically nitrogen and phosphorus move through the soil differently. So nitrogen will leach out of the soil. You have enough water, the nitrogen is going to be gone. But phosphorus, like you said, it basically locks itself into the soil. And so it doesn't leach out the same way that the nitrogen does. And so for gardeners who are planting bulbs, particularly like in fall, the common method of planting bulbs is to take a phosphate fertilizer and put it at the bottom of the hole, because that's where the roots are going to be, because the phosphorus is not going to move through the soil. So you need to put the phosphorus where the roots are going to be growing so that the roots can find that phosphorus. And in the vegetable garden, I see a lot of gardeners who will use a bone meal, for instance, that has phosphorus in it, and they'll just sprinkle it across the surface of the soil. And they're thinking that that's going to flow down into the bed and fertilize it. But the phosphorus doesn't work that way. So it comes down to the soil you're using and whether it has enough phosphorus, and then how you choose to add phosphorus to the soil. And there are so many variations or incorrect methods that I think, at least for most gardeners, they really need to focus on whether they need it, so you don't have the lockout issue. But if you do need it, try to incorporate it into the soil at an appropriate level so that the microbes can break it down and make it available to the plants.
Great advice. Absolutely great advice. There's something else I wanted. Oh, potassium. What is your thought on potassium itself? Oh, look at that place.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and if you look, that's not even all of it. That's just the lower half.
Wow.
Keep going. Keep going. Yeah, there you go.
Wow.
Keep going. Way up there. Way up top. I'm like right. Move the arrow down a little bit to the left. Right there. Those windrows are all gone, and he gave me that like acre and a half.
Wow.
To build my compost.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and you can see the different, like all the different materials. And since that's a really old picture, he's also brought in a lot of crushed gravels, rocks. I built a gizzard, which is basically replicating what happens in a duck's throat, where they have rocks grinding up the seeds out of a 55-gallon drum. And one of the ingredients I started playing with was this blue glass. It's volcanic glass. And I asked a buddy of mine who's very heavily into the large language models to get his agent to search up like blue volcanic glass and what is the compounds or the makeup, the mineral makeup of it. Because I've never seen anything like this. I've seen, obsidian, black glass. And it came back that it's like one of the most valuable basalt mineralization tools we have. But it's in these giant chunks that are super sharp. It's like a decorative landscaping thing. You put it in your fountain or whatever. So I threw it in the gizzard. Oh my God! It turned them into these little like soft round eggs. So all that glass has now been smashed up into sand that you're not going to get cut on it, and I can incorporate that into my compost piles as well. So again, I'm having a blast up there. I didn't mean to get sidetracked. Potassium.
It sounds good. So potassium. So, from a gardening perspective, again, it depends on the form of the potassium and how it's spread. There are major regions of the U.S., particularly the South and Southeast, that they don't call it potassium, they call it potash, because, that's how potassium has been created for millennia, is the ashes from the fireplace that are then spread on the soil. And it's a great form, and it's a great method of getting potassium into the soil. The biggest issue is that if you're using something like wood ash, it's also very alkaline. And it gets back to the idea of you got to do a soil test. I did a video about this a number of years ago where I talk about my own soil, which is generally alkaline on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. And because the pH is already high, if you add potash as a fertilizer, you're raising the pH even higher. And so we were talking about nutrient lockout earlier because of the different types of nutrients. Well, you can have nutrient lockout because of the pH as well. And if you get outside the range of the pH and what the plant needs, particularly with potassium, you can devastate your plants. They'll stay stunted, they'll never grow, they'll never be healthy, because they're not able to uptake any of that potassium to benefit it. And so, talking about bone meal again, here in Colorado State University does not recommend using potash or bone meal because our pH is so high that the plants aren't able to use it. So now we get back to organic matter, where you have to incorporate organic matter to buffer the pH, bring it closer to neutral, so that you can use the potassium and the phosphorus in the soil.
So another interesting fact is that usually compost is very potassium heavy. Have you ever tested your compost to see?
I haven't actually, not for the nutrients. I've done some pH testing and some nitrogen testing, but I've actually never done the other nutrients.
Yeah, check it out, because generally speaking, organic matter, especially if it's garden organic matter or greens, it will have a high level of potassium. And again, it's in a plant of very easy for bacteria to mine. Let's call it plant available. I'll call it biologically available. All right, that might be the final one.
Okay. Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, but I did want to point out one other thing, that you're right. So that blue obsidian is so heavy in silica, and that's one of the other nutrients that we don't talk a lot about. Let's talk about silica a little bit.
And so there are so many of the micronutrients in particular, and there's actually a lot of nutrients we don't talk about. And so the thing that makes plants is carbon, and that is drawn from the atmosphere. And very few people understand the whole concept of photosynthesis and how a plant actually uses carbon dioxide. And so the plants are taking the carbon and the oxygen as well from the air and taking it into the plant for structural reasons. And as I understand it, silica has a key role in that part of the process, as far as the cellular development and the growth of the plants. And so, you now have an abundance of silica, but that's another one of those elements that generally is available in most of the areas that we're all gardening at the levels that the plants need, because it is a micronutrient, so it doesn't need the higher levels that we would with the macronutrients.
The other one is molybdenum and copper and manganese.
Yeah.
Do you have any micronutrient recipe or products that you recommend for people?
No, because that is the one thing about my soil. So my soil is deficient in most of the macronutrients, but it actually has an abundance of most of the micronutrients. So the molybdenum, the copper, the iron, the silica, that long list. Mine are pretty good. I normally do not advocate rock dust as an amendment to soil, because if you do a soil test, you may realize you don't need it. And being on the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, all of the erosion of those mountains has brought all those minerals down into my garden. So that's why I don't have a deficiency. But if there is a deficiency, there's different types of rock dust, and you're talking specifically about silica. That's a great way to get those type of nutrients in the garden. But as a general rule, rock dust is one of those things that can solve some of those issues if you've got the deficiencies. And there are other things you can talk about, ground up oyster shells. There's all kinds of things, as you know, that you can buy and add to your soil depending on what your deficiency is. But I caution gardeners about just doing it because they see a video on YouTube and think it's a good idea without acknowledging that their garden is in a different location than that guy on YouTube that's making a video.
And again, without proper testing, you're blind, and you could hurt yourself really quick, fall off a cliff or run into a car or whatever,
Yeah.
a tree. So it all starts with proper testing and understanding the analysis, which is not easy. So that's where usually I recommend people get some help, either from like guys like Scott, or you can even ask the testing outfits. They often have an agronomist in-house to help answer some of your questions. But the number of clients I've run into that are deficient in those micronutrients, especially molybdenum, is huge. And Molly's another one that's critical in plant enzyme formation, protein folding, and some of the other inner cellular reactions that are critical, like for flavonoid production, terpene production, plant protection. So,
and it's one of those things that for most of us who are just amateur gardeners, we're getting out, the plants do okay. We get some flowers, we get some fruit, we harvest the roots, whatever it is that we're harvesting from our garden or what we want to look at out the window, and they're okay. It's when you start getting deep into the gardening and you recognize that if you can increase some of those levels, you can make things better. And Ken and I were talking beforehand about crops and growing our own food. And that's where it really becomes important to do a soil test so that you can recognize the deficiencies, correct them, and those tomatoes and peppers and melons and corn and everything else you're growing that did okay, if you do the appropriate work to get the levels up to where they should be, it's incredible how abundant a small garden can become.
Agreed, 100%. And again, it's the only limiting factor to biology is chemistry. If the chemistry isn't present, the bacteria can't make it blend available. So that's why I always tell people, start with the chemistry. You get that rocking, we'll take it from there. But hey, listen, I really appreciate you coming on again, Scott. And like to have you periodically come back. Love to see the garden at the harvest time and see how well or how abundant you achieved in your this year's season. And Ken, as always, I appreciate you, my friend, for all the behind the scenes work that you do to make this channel happen every day. And forgive me, but my throat is just killing. It's burning right now.
Well, I hope you feel better. Rest your voice for the rest of the evening if you can.
Yeah, I plan on it. And it's all due to this effing pharmaceuticals. I was doing great, and then I started these pharmaceuticals, and I've had a dry hack that turns to a wet hack, turns to gobs of stuff coming out of my nose, and the whole thing starts over again. So I think my body will eventually deal with it, hopefully sooner rather than
hot toddy.
You're a little early for that, my friend. But definitely I'm doing lemon drops and other things like gargling salt water to just keep the the biology from getting out of control in the back of my throat to help calm things down. But, I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Take care, Leighton. I think Gardner Scott and I will do the questions.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, guys.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Okay. Well, we've got 4 questions right now. Our first one's from Farmer Cheryl. Have either Gardner Scott or Leighton looked at vertical farming? What are the top vertical crops commercially and for home growers?
I can't speak necessarily to commercial crops. There is an increasing number of the cargo containers that are being turned into vertical farms for the hydroponic plants in particular. And so if that's what you're referring to as commercial vertical gardening, where you're developing multiple levels of plants within a building or a space, a lot of the leafy greens are primary crops. Herbs fall into that same basic category. So the stuff I've seen with that type of vertical gardening is a lot of what you see in the store. The organic lettuce, the organic herbs, a lot of those are actually nowadays being produced in vertical farms like that because the plants are more compact. And so you can have layers on a wall of all of those plants that are growing. So you've got a very small footprint, but you have a lot of plants that are growing within that footprint. Within the home garden, I approach the vertical gardening from a vining perspective. So all of my tomatoes grow vertically up twine, and I will direct even zucchini. If you have a zucchini plant, it actually grows vertically if you train it and prune off the lower leaves and have some type of trellis. My melons, my squashes, I grow all of them up trellises with that same basic idea. You have a smaller footprint, so you have the plants closer together. And instead of letting a squash plant sprawl across an area that's 6 by 8 feet, and that's all that's growing in that squash area, you now have multiple plants in a 1 foot by 4 foot space that are all growing up a 5 or 6 foot tall trellis and then cascading down the other side for easy harvest. So that's how I use vertical gardening or vertical growing in the home garden, is with trellises, and therefore growing more plants in a space than what the seed packet. Seed packets had a lot of great information, but there are a lot of times based on how you garden that information is useless. So you'll see recommendations for squash plants that say plant the plants 18 inches apart in rows that are 3 to 4 feet apart. Well, that's because the assumption is that you're letting them sprawl across the ground and you need that much space. I put my squash plants about 12 inches apart and I grow them straight up. And I do that with my tomatoes and anything else that's going to be more than just a couple feet tall.
I know we were talking about you're using the cattle panels. You were using it for both, shade cloth and everything, but that's great for the vertical farming as well, to use that. But I don't know if she's more talking about a lot of people are buying these tubes that have the areas off the sides. I think maybe that's more the vertical farming she's talking about, at least for the home grower.
Sure. So I actually have a new hydroponic system. Wally is what it's called. I haven't actually set it up yet, but it's one of those systems. It actually has 3 levels, and I think there's 6 pockets on each level. And again, it's hydroponic farming, so it can be done indoors or outdoors. I've done that. I caution a lot of gardeners to go slow with it, because the biggest problem with those type of systems, as I see it, and it's what Leighton and I were talking about, it's the nutrient balance. It is when you're doing any type of hydroponic growing, and those vertical systems are almost exclusively hydroponics of one type or another. You have to figure out how you're going to get the nutrients to the plants. And most of the recipes, most of the packets that are being sold by the people that are selling you these hydroponic vertical systems, they don't necessarily include all those micronutrients. And so they're focused on those macronutrients, and the plants will grow, but they won't necessarily grow as well as they would if you learn the chemistry, like Leighton was referencing. Learn the chemistry of what the plants need and what the ratios are, and then you can reach the point where you can create your own blend, or at least know where to go to get the blend of all of the different powders and liquids that you're going to need in a system like that.
Yeah, I know I've done not so much hydroponic, but I've done aquaponics, I've done aeroponics, and a lot of those systems, you're buying these nutrients, where I would prefer to be in soil and buy, some good soil, and then buy good amendments, because then it's diversity. Like, if you're only putting so much in your mix growing hydroponically, then what are you missing that your plant could be using to give you that extra nutrition in your plant? So there's a lot of different ones, but I've seen people, do a wall of, Coca-Cola bottles that they've cut the top of and, stuff soil in, and they're growing vertically that way. So there's so much you can do. I like the resourceful people that aren't necessarily buying these systems, but using what they can find to recycle to build these systems.
Yeah. And one method, I haven't made a video about it. It's been on my list for a long time, but something as simple as rain gutters. I've got fences that I've been putting up in my garden. And part of the reason I've been doing some of these fences is to put rain gutters, and then put the soil in the rain gutter and grow lettuces and strawberries. And basically you have a wall of plants that you can do, either, from an aesthetic perspective, you like the look of it, or you're doing it as a crop to harvest.
Well, the one I saw, he buried the rain gutter. And I think he was using plastic pails, where he was cutting a hole and creating a sip system. And then that part of the net pot was sticking down into the rain gutter. So he was watering underground, because he was in a really desert-like environment. And it was saving him a tremendous amount of water doing that. It was kind of a wild idea.
Yeah. And I see in the comments from Cheryl and a few others are talking about green stalks. Yeah. And I'm a huge fan of green stalks. I got 5 green stalk vertical gardens. Actually, they're one of my partners. If you use the code Gardener Scott and buy a green stalk, you get $10 off. So cool. I visited their factory. It's a family-run business. I really like the product, but it's another option for vertical growing, where you are growing in the soil and then just watering from the reservoirs at each level. So yeah. I love the green stalks as a vertical option as well.
Fantastic. So let's go to our next question here. It gets so hot in my inside nursery.
Outside
nursery. Get it? Outside nursery. How can I get it to be cooler?
Yeah, it's all about the ventilation. And so my greenhouse is a planted greenhouse, and it actually has a door on each side, and then it has a window above the door, and then on the back side I've got 2 vents, and I'll have the roof vents open and the doors open, and those top doors open in the summer, and my greenhouse is still 10 degrees hotter than the outside air. So it's hard. You have to have airflow. And the biggest issue that I have in my area, as windy as it is, there are many days in the summer where there's no wind. So you can have all the windows open, all the doors open, and if you don't have airflow to exchange the air, the greenhouse is going to continue to get hotter. And so I'm actually going to be building a new greenhouse here in just the next couple of weeks. And in the new greenhouse, I'm going to put thermostatically controlled fans to do that. My current greenhouse, I don't have fans, but that's what you got to do. You got to have all of the vents, you got to have windows and doors, and you have to have fans to move the air. Then you can get some control over the temperature.
Well, and it's a lot of it is that control. Like I've seen the ones where the top of the greenhouse, as the temperature goes up, the window goes up to allow ventilation. But if you don't have anything at the bottom for the air to be drawn in, the cooler air, it's not going to really do much.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't know if you know much about jumping worms, but Squishy Mirror thinks he has some jumping worms in his compost.
Yeah, so I was actually talking about jumping worms in my live stream this morning. It has become a topic that a lot of people are concerned about. And just a couple weeks ago, there was an announcement that Colorado has now been invaded by jumping worms. And so they're slowly moving across the country. The thing about the jumping worms, like all earthworms, is that they have a very specific range of temperatures that they do best at, and that you get outside that range, they either begin to go dormant or they die. And so there's the jumping worms have that same basic range, but it's a wider range than some of the worms that we have. And so I'm not too concerned in my part of Colorado because it gets so cold in the winter that the ground freezes and the jumping worm stays pretty close to the surface. And so the frozen soil is one of those things that can help keep the jumping worm under control. But for the other areas that are hot in summer and warm throughout the rest of the year, they're becoming invasive, and they're really becoming a problem. One of the ways we talked about on my show this morning was solarization, where you actually warm up the soil outside their range. So if you start getting into the 100 to 105 degree range in your soil, then you can kill the cocoons and the worms in the soil. And so you use a solarization method. Basically, clear plastic is a great way to do it. You spread clear plastic over the ground, weight it or around the edges to maintain essentially a flat greenhouse on top of your soil. And after about a month, because it takes weeks, after about a month, if you've got sustained sun and temperatures, then you can kill any of the worms or the cocoons that they've laid in the soil. But they're difficult to deal with. And that's why they're continuing to spread across the country, because they just move on until they take all of the organic matter and move on to more organic matter.
Well, and it's something that Cranberry Cass is saying, aren't worms non-native to the Americas?
Yeah, and that's how I understand it, that, hundreds of years ago, the Europeans primarily bringing their trees and their shrubs and their plants from Europe and then bringing them to the Americas basically brought the worms with them. Yeah.
And that's the thing. You look at how Mother Nature does things, and you can have things coming through the wind and the birds and the fish. Everything gets transported everywhere. But you have plants that you want to keep contained, bamboo, and you were mentioning one earlier. It's all in taking the precautions for you not to have these problems.
Yeah. And it's important, for gardeners to understand that the most communities and pretty much every county that I'm aware of has a list of obnoxious weeds, and some, depending on the weed, you're not allowed to grow it. And those plants are in many cases landscape plants that we have a spurge that is on the list in my county that was brought in as a decorative landscape plant. and the conditions in this region are perfect for it to spread. You know, kudzu in the south is a prime example of a plant that's been brought in for one purpose, and then the conditions are ideal and it just spreads perniciously throughout the landscape. And so understanding what plants are recommended for your garden, and then maybe more importantly, understanding what plants are not advised for your garden, can really help all of us be better for the environment by trying to avoid some of those plants escaping.
Well, and I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, the landscapers bringing in these specialty plants because somebody saw it on TikTok and went, "Oh, I love that plant," and not understanding that it's actually a invasive. Like, I don't know how, I know Walmart sells all kinds of different plants. I don't even think they even consider those kinds of things in.
Well, sometimes they do. I see Squishy Mirror talking about Bradford pears, and so Bradford pears are in many areas of the country considered an obnoxious weed. They can take over to get into the waterways. They just as a tree are in some places outlawed because they can be so bad. But in my area of Colorado, I have a Bradford pear in my garden. They're sold by Walmart and local nurseries because it doesn't spread. It's actually difficult to grow Bradford pear. Of all of my fruit trees, the one that has grown the slowest and that has the fewest branches after the 5 years that I've had it is my Bradford pear, because this is not an environment that it does well in. And so I'm trying to actually grow Bradford pear because it's so difficult to grow in my area, and other people are cutting them down and burning them because it's against the law to actually have them.
And I like what Baby Daddy Grow says here. Every gardener or farmer is the first warning sign of invasive species and noxious weeds. We need to know as gardeners, you know, what these plants look like. Have the app where you can check the you know, the leaf structure of the plant, and it goes, oh, it's this type of plant, and then find out if that's an invasive plant in your area.
Well, and then you should take action. You know, that's something. So Russian olive trees are considered obnoxious weeds in my county, and you can be fined by the county if you have them. And so it's one of those things that, so my dog Mala wants to say hello. It's getting close to her dinner time. But the thing about the Russian olive, the last house I was at, my neighbor had a Russian olive tree in his front yard. And I said, hey, that's a Russian olive tree. And he's like, oh, I like it. It's like, but you're not allowed to have it. You can be fined. And he's like, but I want it. And he kept it. And it wasn't until a county employee was driving by and saw it and gave him a warning, and then gave him a ticket when he didn't remove it. And now this I'm working in another garden in the city. The neighbor on the backside of the fence has a big Russian olive tree. And she's been told that Russian olive trees spread and they're obnoxious weeds and they need to be taken out. And she's taken no effort to take it out because she likes it. And so, yeah, that's exactly right. It's up to each gardener to recognize it. But I think more importantly, to take action so that it's not a problem, because her beautiful Russian olive tree is extending 20 feet into the area that we're trying to build a garden. So I've been out chopping roots and trying to do all I can to get rid of the tree that has spread into this other yard, and she doesn't care. And I think that in itself is criminal, that you don't care what impact you have on your neighbors or the whole planet ultimately.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of people like that. You know, it's me. I don't care about anybody else. But we've got one last question, and before your dog's going to chew your face off for supper, what is a good level, either ppm or other, of silicon in either a test or soil?
And so I don't know a specific number in my head, but I know that when you do a soil test, particularly if you do it from a reputable source like a university, they'll have that information. And so all the soil tests I've done break it down, and so it will say, like the level should be 20 to 50 parts per million or whatever that number is. And I honestly don't know the number. And then your test will tell you whether you're within that range and whether you need to do anything to get the nutrient level up. And that holds true not just with that nutrient, but with all of them. And much of the time it is based on your own soil and whether you need to amend it as part of the test. And then if you add to it, and that's what Leighton and I were talking about, doing supplemental testing later on to see if you were able to bring it within that particular range.
Yeah. And that's what people need to understand. Do a little bit of research. Like we were brought up that scale earlier in the day, or earlier in the show, I should say, where you can check, how things work together. And it's all about that balance of diversity in both biology and in the nutrients, macro and micro.
Yeah. Well, and it gets back also to what Leighton and I were first talking about with the compost, that, the approach I take with the combination pizza. You take all of the different plants in your garden, and some of the plants in your garden are going to take the silica up into their leaves, along with all those other nutrients we've been talking about today. And if you compost those plants, you're now adding that silica back into the beds that may need more of it. And so the weeds are great at telling you deficiencies in your soil, because different plants grow in areas that have certain deficiencies, and some plants grow in areas that have abundance of other types of nutrients. And by mixing those plants, what many of us call weeds, into the compost, we can incorporate and bring up the levels of many of those micronutrients by just using the plants that are all around us.
That's why I like to call weeds medicinal plants for the soil, because that's Mother Nature trying to amend the soil that she's making that weed sprout. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, absolutely. You have your your different levels of soil development, and so the pioneer plants, this is a fascinating part of how soil is built, is exactly that. The weed seeds are blowing in every direction for miles around, and when they land in an area that is deficient in something that particular plant can mine, it sprouts and it grows and it sends down a deep root, and it brings all of that ingredient up into its leaves. And then the winter sets in and those leaves die and fall to the ground and release those nutrients. And then more seeds are blowing through the wind, and now that area around that plant is a little bit richer. And so another plant pops in and starts sprouting. And before you know it, you have an entire forest over a period of millennia. And it all starts with a weed that was the first step in developing a good soil.
Well, I think that's how Mother Nature, now she took billions of years to do it and slowly develop all this. And then us humans, we're so smart, we're going to go, well, no, we want it this way. It's crazy, but it's our nature to say, we can do it better.
Yeah. And, and I'm, of course, as an avid gardener, I am guilty of that, because I grow plants in my garden like tomatoes that are not native to Colorado, and I do everything I can to get those plants to grow. So, all of us are fighting Mother Nature with every garden that we have. But if you can try to learn to work with her the most that you can, it is an easier process.
Well, I know one of the things is terra preta, your local environment, and you can change a tomato plant was growing in, say, Peru, and slowly move it into the environment local to you. But it takes, years and years and years for that plant to switch over and add different parts, it's more cold hardy or more heat resistant, but it takes time for the plant to make those changes, and you got to use seeds from that plant to replant and change things. And you're doing your own genetic modification by doing that. But Scott, I know I know your dog's hungry, and I don't want to keep you. Leighton's ran away because he's sick, but I so much appreciate what you do, Scott. And guys, if you haven't heard of Gardener Scott's book, go to his website, check out his book. Amazing content. You're going to learn a tremendous amount, about raised bed gardening and gardening in general. So take the time, go over there, check it out. And if you can, get that book. You were saying, Scott, somebody just bought 2 or 3 more copies for being able to give them away.
Yeah, it's I was just contacted by Wisconsin Public Radio last week because they discovered my book and like it, and so I'm going to be on their show in a couple of weeks. And so it's a great reference source, and it's being slowly discovered by gardeners around the world because it's actually available in the UK and Europe as well. And so I appreciate you saying that, because I'm very proud of it, and people that have it and have read it, no one has said to me that they don't like it, and a whole bunch of people have said that they do. So I
nobody's been burning your book.
Judgment. That's right.
Oh yeah, guys, thank you so much for being here. Chat, you guys are amazing. We love you every time you show up and give us a hard time. So we will talk to you on Wednesday with myself and Andy Lopez. So check that show out, and keep watching, keep learning, and keep growing, guys. Take care, everybody.